And the idea was that by blowing up these villages and eliminating their physical presence, refugees would be less likely to return since their homes were no longer there. And it would make the landscape, it would sort of de-Palestinianize the landscape. Basically, it would no longer look like there was a village there. So you're erasing the memory of Palestinian presence on the land.
Hazem Jamjoom is the editor of Al-Majdal, the English-language quarterly magazine of the Badil Resource Center for Palestinian Residency and Refugee Rights in Bethlehem, Palestine. Alternate Focus sat down with Hazem in his office in the West Bank, where he explained the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Well, the roots of what we call the Nakba, which is the Arabic word for catastrophe, also called the 1948 war, and for the Zionist movement is called the War of Independence, actually go back to Europe in the late 19th century. And the idea was, after centuries of anti-Semitism and actually sort of a peak or spike in anti-Semitism during that period, there were different responses within the Jewish community in Europe to how to deal with anti-Semitism. And so as we see actually with immigrant communities in Europe and North America today, one of the very common responses was what we could call assimilation, or sort of duck down and hope nobody notices that you're Jewish. Another response within the community was more sort of radical or even revolutionary, which saw anti-Semitism as just one side of the oppression brought about by these European regimes. And so they were calling for different things like the overthrow of these systems because they were capitalist and imperialist, and that anti-Semitism was just one side of these many different aspects of these oppressive regimes. In the late 19th century, it was sort of there emerged a new response to anti-Semitism, which was very much informed by European culture at the time, specifically the idea that if you're European, you have some kind of right to go to Africa, Asia, Latin America, and colonize, and that the indigenous communities in these areas could be treated the same as the trees and the rocks and the other mineral resources. They didn't really have rights, so to speak. Another aspect was this new idea of the nation, that the humanity is divided into these types of people. So there's Germans, there's British, and for each one of these nations, there's some kind of right to a political entity, a state. And so it's this period that we see German unification under the idea of a state for the German people, etc. So the idea was that as a response to anti-Semitism, we can consider the Jewish people, and this is a unique case because it's a religious group before this idea comes out, that this religious group is a nation and deserves a state. And by having this state somewhere outside of Europe that we can colonize elsewhere, this would be the response to anti-Semitism. This state would protect the Jewish people from anti-Semitism, and it would be a place where Jewish people could come together and thrive. Also, interestingly, this idea of the Jewish state is invested with the different sort of utopic ideas and visions of different kinds of political trends within the Jewish community. So Jewish socialists in Europe thought of the state as the socialist workers' state, while fascists within the Jewish community saw this as, the ethnically pure Jewish state that was in line with their political thinking. So there's a very wide spectrum of, this movement becomes called Zionism, and a very wide spectrum of Zionist thought, what this state would look like. And there were even ideas, the Palestinian community within Zionist thought is largely invisible. But as Jewish colonization begins and people begin to realize not only are there people in Palestine, but there's a thriving economy and a culture, and it's part of a wider civilization in the region, some thoughts begin to emerge as to how to create For example, the workers' state of Jewish and non-Jewish Palestinian workers, or of one state for all of the people on the land. But the idea of the Jewish state remains, and remains the dominant idea. It wasn't always Palestine that was the main goal. Different trends within the Zionist movement had different ideas. It's notable that the religious Jewish establishment opposed Zionism overall because it was counter to the teachings or the scriptures. The idea of creating the Jewish state before the coming of the Messiah was considered a form of heresy by many rabbis. And Zionists got over this by saying that no, by creating the Jewish state, we could accelerate the coming of the Messiah. So to make kind of a long story short, the decision to come to Palestine is made at a conference at the end of the century that's held in Basel in Switzerland. And institutions are set up to facilitate this goal. The main institution is one called the Zionist Organization. In the early 50s, it's renamed the World Zionist Organization. And this is the main umbrella of the Zionist movement and continues to be until today. The act of bringing Jewish people from outside of Palestine to Palestine, sort of that responsibility is given to something called the Jewish Colonization Agency. After World War I, the word colonization is no longer in vogue, so the name of the organization is changed to the Jewish Agency. And this becomes a kind of de facto government of the Jewish community in Palestine in the 20s, 30s, and early 40s. And the leadership of the Jewish Agency become the same people who become the prime minister and the ministers and the government and the leading officials of the Israeli state after it's established. The other main organization here is something called the Jewish National Fund. And it was given the responsibility and set up to acquire land in Palestine and neighboring areas for the purpose of settling Jewish people, and in a sense exclusively Jewish people. This organization also continues to exist today, although after 1948 it changed its public image because what it began to do was to plant trees in parks and forests which are built on the land of Palestinian refugees. Most often you can actually see the destroyed villages as you walk through these parks and forests. And it set out in earnest. I mean, most of this required massive fundraising abroad, and this money was used both to bring Jewish people in through the working of the Jewish Agency and to try to acquire land. Palestinians began to wake up to this in the 20s. What had happened is in World War I, the British had defeated the Ottoman Empire and its allies, and so Palestine came under British occupation, or what was euphemistically called the Mandate. So Palestine was sort of held in trust by the British. And what the British had done in 1917 was promised the Jewish people a homeland in the land of Palestine. This was the infamous Balfour Declaration of 1917. And it's notable that Balfour himself was a prominent anti-Semite. You know, he's on record in the British Parliament saying that we shouldn't have Jewish people in Britain. And this is sort of one of the early signs of the kind of common interests between the Zionist movement, which wanted Jewish people to leave Europe and go somewhere else, and many of the anti-Semitic currents in Europe, which wanted no Jewish people to be in Europe. Now, in the 20s and 30s, the British begin to really help the Zionist movement. How? By facilitating immigration, Jewish immigration into Palestine. In the 30s, when there's a Palestinian uprising, the British begin to arm and train Jewish police forces, what they called the settlement police. Certain Jewish military units are trained specifically on how to punish a village, which involved home demolitions and sort of gathering people into central spaces and different kinds of collective punishment. And a host of other laws that gave preferential treatment to Jewish community members in the fields of work, in the fields of different kinds of services, facilitating the transfer of land from Palestinians to the Jewish National Fund and other Zionist organizations. And most notably, and this is probably one of the most important things, is that with the coming to power of Nazism and fascism in Europe, and the eventually the Holocaust, there's large number of Jewish people who just don't want to be in Europe anymore, refugees of the Holocaust. And what countries like the United States, Canada, Britain, Australia do is they close off their borders to Jewish refugees. Again, this is very much a sign of anti-Semitism in what we call the West. And on the ground meant that a Jewish refugee from the Holocaust had very few options on where to go. And one of the only options was Palestine. So even if they were not ideologically Zionist, then one of their only options was to actually come to Palestine. So there's a huge influx of Jewish refugees trying to come to Palestine. And in this sort of horrendous way, this is kind of a Zionist dream, in the sense that there are now many more Jewish people who want to come to Palestine. And the only way to create a Jewish state in Palestine is if Jewish people actually come to Palestine. The main problem that the Zionist movement had, and they discover this when they start to come here and see that there's actually people, and there's a society, and there's an economy, and there's a culture, is that to create a Jewish state, you need a Jewish majority, but the majority is Palestinian, is the indigenous people who are not Jewish. So beginning in the 20s and more earnest in 30s and the 40s, the leaders of the movement begin to think in earnest, logistically, how do we go about creating a Jewish state? Before this, again, the Palestinians were invisible. Palestinians would voluntarily just leave because they were asked to. As it progressed, there were more ideas of how to sort of pay people to leave, entice them, create job opportunities outside of the country, sort of different proposals on how to get Palestinians to voluntarily leave. But also from very early on, in the 20s, but definitely in the 30s, Zionist leaders begin to write down their thoughts in letters to one another, to other family members, etc., that the way to create the Jewish state would have to be by getting rid of this Palestinian majority, so that those remaining would be the Jewish majority. Now, there aren't very many ways to do this. One way would be to kill off as many Palestinians as possible, which would be genocide. Another way would be what was done in South Africa, where you had an indigenous majority, and what the colonizing minority did was said, okay, you can stay, but you don't exist politically. No vote, no presence in parliament, which means that you don't actually exist politically. You only exist as far as your exploitable labor exists. And option 3 is kick out the largest number of the indigenous community, which is what the Zionist leaders had begun contemplating. They used different words for it: transfer, population exchange, etc. But the idea is to entice, force as many Palestinians as possible to leave. And beginning in the 30s, the sort of military wing of the Zionist movement begins to put together the actual logistical military plan for how to do this. And this plan is revised 3 times. And the 4th version is Plan D, or in Hebrew, Plan Dalet. And really what the movement is waiting for is the opportunity to begin the implementation of what's been called the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, or the forcing the largest number of Palestinians to leave the country. The opportunity comes when Britain, after World War II, overextended, unable to maintain the areas of its vast empire that it couldn't continue to hold on to cheaply, specifically India and Palestine, hands over responsibility of these 2 places to the United Nations, the newly formed United Nations, and says, it's your problem now, you deal with it. And what the United Nations does is it forms a committee and sends them over to discuss, or to find out, to propose what the United Nations can do. And this committee comes to Palestine. The Palestinians and the Arabs boycott the committee because there's an understanding that it's looking into how to create a Jewish state on a land that Palestinians and Arabs had been living on for centuries and didn't see how it was that they were legitimately going to create a Jewish state. So there was a boycott, and so the people that the committee only spoke to were from the Zionist movement, for the most part. ultimately, what the majority, the slight majority in the committee recommends is partition. The minority says that no, it should remain one state for both people. The minority decision is that there should be two states. It hands over about 56% of the land to the Zionist movement, and says this will be the Jewish majority state. Jerusalem and Bethlehem get transformed into this special corpus separatum, an internationally operated zone. And then the 43% of the land, the remaining part, is to be the Arab majority state. Now, it's very important. Now, this is called the UN Partition Resolution, or UN General Assembly Resolution 181. It's very important to note that even though, all the Palestinians and Arabs opposed it, and there's a lot of questions about the legitimacy of this resolution to begin with, the resolution itself does not call for population exchange. In the case of India, it does specifically say that there should be population exchange, and there was the horrendous results that we saw with the deaths of thousands of Hindus and Muslims in the process of population exchange. In the case of Palestine, the resolution is actually quite clear that Palestinians and Jews have the option of where they want to live. They can choose to stay in the piece of land that they are in, and they can choose to move to the other one. And they have the right fully to citizenship. And if they're going to be giving a property, they have the right to compensation for that property. Even this fundamental aspect of what's called the Partition Plan, or Resolution 181, ends up being violated by the Zionist movement. Now, when the UN issues this on November 29th, 1947, this resolution, this is essentially the spark of the 1948 war. Basically, the Zionist movement has now received international legitimacy to create its own state. We should note that by this time, by 1947, the Zionist movement, with all of the refugees coming from Europe and with all of the work of the Jewish Colonization Agency until then, had only basically accumulated about 600,000 Jewish migrants into Palestine, while there were about 1.2 to 1.3 million non-Jewish Palestinians. So 1/3 of the population, far stretched from being a majority. Also, in terms of land, the work of the Jewish National Fund, and a lot of it has a big question mark on it in terms of sort of buying property from absentee landlords who had acquired the land in pretty tricky ways, recruiting Palestinian collaborators to buy land because Palestinians, once they realized what was up, stopped selling land to the Jewish National Fund, but had only acquired about 6.7% of the land, a very tiny part of, not tiny, but a very small part of the land. So here again, the problem was stated very clearly. In 1947, we're only 1/3 of the population. We're only 6.7%. We only control 6.7% of the land. To create this Jewish state that we're dreaming of, we need this 600,000 to become the majority, and we need to take control of most of the land. And so the plan is put in place. Plan Dalit, which we talked about, the military, the logistics of how to create this Jewish state begins. And the plan essentially calls for connecting existing Jewish settlements to one another, so clearing out Palestinian towns and villages between them, as well as clearing out Palestinian villages from borders with the neighboring Arab states in case of Arab attack. And this is what takes place. The plan officially begins its implementation in March of 1948. Between March and May of that year, about half of the Palestinian refugees are expelled. About 300,000 Palestinians become refugees. And on May 14th, Israel is declared an independent state. After this, Arab armies invade. Of course, there's also sort of, the way that the official story is that, these massive armies come and this little state of Israel defends itself and wins. And in the course of the war, people leave and become refugees. So that's the official story of why there are Palestinian refugees and why Palestinian refugees are the Arab state's fault for invading in the first place. So, of course, we should remember that half of these refugees were expelled before any Arab state invaded, quote unquote. But also that most of these Arab states were either newly independent or still under some form of mandate system as was the case with Syria and Lebanon. The Egyptian army sent in basically soldiers with very little training and very old weapons, many of which were dysfunctional. And they didn't have much success militarily, to the point that one of the battalions that almost stayed intact went back to Egypt with the express intent of getting rid of the monarchy in Egypt, and within 4 years had done so. And Jamal Abdel Nasser, who became the president of Egypt after the removal of the monarchy, fought in Palestine, in Fallujah. The only really trained and armed Arab army was the Jordanian army, which also had control over the Iraqi army since they were coming through Jordan. And the Zionist leadership had already sort of made a deal with the Jordanians, that the Jordanians would get the West Bank and Israel could do what it pleased with the rest of the country. And I mean, Palestinian refugees, many of them knew this long before because they saw the behavior of the army, the Jordanian army, when it came in. But I mean, the research has been done pretty conclusively in the Israeli archives on this deal by as an Israeli professor named Avi Shleim in a book called Collusion Across the Jordan. So it wasn't really a miraculous victory. It was a much better armed and trained army, much of which was trained in the fight against the Nazis in Europe. So trained by official European armies and by the British here in Palestine. The results, I mean, so most of the way that the villages, Palestinian villages and towns were dealt with in 1948 was that the army would come in and surround them for 2 or 3 sides, leaving one side open, facing sort of towards the closest border. So the idea wasn't to kill off as many Palestinians as possible. It was to force them to leave, specifically to cross a border and become refugees. Usually, and there's a general pattern for how this took place, the army would come in and use artillery bombardment to force as many people to leave before the ground troops would go in. Later in 1948, the Israeli military acquired an air force, and the villages that were attacked after this experienced aerial bombardment as well. After this, the village would be occupied physically by ground troops. Those who remained would be rounded up in a central area. The men would be separated from the women and children. The women and children would be forced to flee, often with guns blaring behind them. The men would, the Jewish National Fund had kept files on each Palestinian town and village, which had, the name of the village, the types of crops grown, the size of its land, but also the names of Palestinian collaborators who'd worked with the Jewish National Fund, as well as Palestinians who'd been involved with the resistance. And so they would often use these collaborators to kind of pick out those who were involved in the resistance. They would be executed, and then those men who remained would either be put into prison camps, into labor camps, or forced to leave as well. So this is the general pattern, but every village has its own unique story as well. So some villages hold out for 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, facing a series of assaults, military assaults. Other villages, the military bombardment was enough to make them so afraid for their lives that they left. The use of massacres by the Zionist forces was also very effective. I mean, they committed these massacres, but also ensured that news of these massacres would travel. So one of the most famous of these is the Deir Yassin massacre in April of 1948. And I mean, the cases of rape and looting and murder and then parading the bodies in the streets of Jerusalem made it so that news of this massacre traveled very, very quickly and frightened people to the point where they were much more likely to leave their village. It's near Jerusalem, Deir Yassin, which is also near Bethlehem. So many of the refugees here in this area who are from the villages and towns close to Bethlehem and Jerusalem are ones where it's very common in sort of Nakba survivor stories to hear that Deir Yassin was one of the main reasons that they left. News of Deir Yassin made them, as soon as they heard that the Zionist forces were coming, they left, for fear that what happened at Deir Yassin would happen to them. Small military units would also come after the village or town was occupied and the army had moved on. a small military unit would come in responsible for looting anything valuable in the homes and then just blowing up the houses. And the idea was that by blowing up these villages and eliminating their physical presence, refugees would be less likely to return since their homes were no longer there. And it would make the landscape, it would sort of de-Palestinianize the landscape. Basically, it would no longer look like there was a village there. So you're erasing the memory of Palestinian presence on the land. By the end of the Nakba, around 13,000 Palestinians had been killed. Over 530 towns and villages had been depopulated and destroyed. And over 750,000 Palestinians had become refugees. Some Palestinians who were displaced from their towns and villages didn't cross a border and sort of remained in the state but living somewhere else. These are what we would call internally displaced people. Today there's about 300,000 Palestinian citizens of the State of Israel who continue to be internally displaced. They live in the state, they have citizenship in the state, but their lands in the village have been confiscated, and they're not allowed to go back to their village and live there. Many of these villages, again, have been transformed into Jewish National Fund parks and forests. In other cases, it's land that's now part of an Israeli kibbutz or moshav or city or town. In the cities, Palestinians who were able to remain in the cities, and this is a very tiny minority, were most often concentrated into one neighborhood in the city. So in Jerusalem, it was Baqa neighborhood. In Yafa, it was Ajami neighborhood. And these cities were sealed off physically. And between 1948 and 1966, Israel governed Palestinians with a separate set of laws than it governed its Jewish citizens. The citizens, Palestinians who remained and became citizens, were governed under what we call the military laws, which are an extension of the emergency laws that the British had put in place. One of the defining aspects of these laws was that it controlled mobility into and out of Palestinian villages and those neighborhoods that Palestinians were confined to during these years, from 48 to 66. So it was you needed written permission from the military commander of your sort of reservation or of your area to be able to leave or come back in.